London was never meant to exist. Most great cities grew on their own, out of a village on fertile land. But here there was nothing, an empty riverbank, no settlement, not even a name. The city was built from scratch by foreigners. The Romans needed a place to cross the river, and then it was burned again and again. Rebel tribes, the Great Fire, bombs from the sky. Any one of those blows would have been enough to erase it forever. But London never vanished. Every time, it rebuilt itself and came back larger than before. From a Roman fort on a marsh to the greatest city on earth, the heart of a world empire. Today, nearly 9 million people live here, and 300 languages are spoken in its streets. This is the story of a city that foreign hands began on an empty patch of ground and that then refused to die. And to understand how a river crossing grew into the capital of the world, we have to go back to the very beginning. For a long time, early London could only be imagined, from broken pottery and old engravings. Now, using AI trained on historical imagery, we can see the city much as it once was. The Roman port on its timber wharves, the medieval bridge crowded with houses, London in the smoke of the Great Fire. 2,000 years in a single video. Let's begin. It all began because an army needed to cross a river. In AD 43, the Roman army invaded Britain. Pushing inland, it needed a crossing over the wide Thames, and there was only one good place for it. Here the river first narrowed enough to bridge, yet stayed deep enough for seagoing ships to ride the tide right up to it. There was no better spot. The Romans threw a bridge across, and at its northern end they planted a settlement, and so, on empty ground, by military calculation, Londinium was born. And the city grew fast, because it was not a fortress, but a port. Ships rode up on the tide, unloaded at the wharves. Barges carried the goods inland. Within about 20 years, Londinium had overtaken the old provincial capital to become the chief trading city of Roman Britain. Larger than Pompeii, with its own forum, baths, and an amphitheater seating over 6,000. Curiously, the amphitheater was built to hold roughly as many people as there were grown men in the city. It could fit nearly the whole male population at once. And then, in the year 60, came something that would repeat through the city's entire history. It was burned to the ground. A tribe led by the warrior queen Boudica rose against Rome and wiped Londinium off the map. The trace of that fire, a layer of scorched red clay, is still found beneath the city today. You can see it in the cuttings dug for the underground, and here you see the city's defining trait. It was rebuilt and rebuilt larger. After Boudica, the timber huts gave way to stone houses with marble facing and tiled floors. A forum and basilica rose, the largest north of the Alps. And late in the 2nd century, the city was ringed with a wall, the very wall that would fix London's boundaries for 1,000 years. Pieces of it still stand today by Tower Hill and the Barbican. The outline of the Roman amphitheater is here too, traced on the floor of the Guildhall Yard, only uncovered in 1988. And the corner of the Roman fort, which stood in the city's northwest, falls exactly where the towers of the Barbican rise today. The Romans chose these spots, and 2,000 years later, the city obediently stood again on the very same ground. But Rome was weakening. By the early 5th century, the legions were needed at home, and in 410, they left the island for good. With no empire, no trade, no government, the city emptied, and here begins the strangest part of its story. London was simply left behind. The Saxons, who came after the Romans, had no love of cities. They abandoned the great walled Londinium whole, walls, forum, baths, and all, and built a village beside it, along the bank where the Strand runs today. They called it Londonwick, and the Roman city stood empty like a huge stone shell, with no one living in it. It was almost unbelievable. A finished stone city stood ready behind its wall, and for 300 years, people chose to live in huts of timber and clay instead. That lasted until the Vikings came. With their raids, the defenseless trading post of Londonwick, out on its open bank, became a death trap. And so, in 886, King Alfred the Great made the decision that created London anew. He moved the people back inside the Roman walls. The old stone shell the Saxons had shunned for 3 centuries was useful again. Behind it, they could shelter from the Vikings. Alfred laid out the streets inside the walls afresh. And here is the remarkable thing. That grid, sketched in the 9th century, outlasted everything and held until the Great Fire of 1666, almost 800 years. The old names survive even now. The Strand remembers abandoned Londonwick, and streets like Wood Street lie over the Saxon quarters. By this time, a division had appeared that would define London forever. A little upriver, apart from the walled trading city, King Edward the Confessor founded his own abbey and palace, Westminster. The abbey was finished right around 1066, and it stands on the same spot to this day. British monarchs are still crowned there. From then on, London had, in effect, 2 hearts: the city for money and trade, and Westminster for crown and church. A road along the river ran between them. The city still carries that split today. And in 1066, the Normans came, and they brought stone. William the Conqueror took London, and at once showed the citizens who was master. He built a fortress right by the river, and built it not to defend the city, but as a threat to it. This was the Tower, the White Tower, raised by Bishop Gundulf. Londoners understood perfectly. The chronicles record them saying these walls had been built as an insult to them. The stone for the Norman work was shipped from France. The tower still stands today, almost 1,000 years, exactly where William put it. But the defining structure of the Middle Ages was not the castle. It was the bridge. For centuries, the Thames had been crossed on timber footbridges that the floods swept away. Then, between 1176 and 1209, a stone London Bridge was thrown across the river. It took 33 years to build, and it became not just a crossing, but a street over the water. Houses and shops several stories high stood on it, a chapel, a water wheel. For 6 centuries, right up to 1750, it was the only bridge across the Thames in all of London, so all trade, everyone coming from the south, funneled onto it. The bridge made the city rich, and beyond the walls a city grew, cramped, wooden, deafeningly loud. Houses were built the medieval way, stone below, timber above, the roof too often thatched. The rich had 5 or 6 stories leaning out over the lane. Craftsmen settled by trade, and the memory lives in street names still on the map today. Bread Street, where the bread was baked. Friday Street, where the fish was sold. Poultry, the city was ruled by the trade guilds. By the end of the 13th century, there were around 200 of them. Brotherhoods of craft that held the government of the city in their hands. They chose the Lord Mayor, and the most famous of them, Dick Whittington. A cloth merchant held that office 4 times. A real man who later became a fairy tale. But behind the guild signboards, the city lived wild and violent. The chronicles preserve the everyday scenes. Goldsmiths in a brawl chopped off a saddler's leg with an axe. The women of a whole parish stoned a foreign murderer dead in the street, with rubbish and filth. Law students rolled a barrel packed with stones down a hill, to the great terror of the neighbors. It was a city quick-tempered, crowded, and dangerous. We know exactly what the city sounded and smelled like. By the 15th century, a contemporary wrote, "There was no noisier city in the world. The hammers of craftsmen, church bells, the curfew bell, the cries of traders, all of it could be heard from the surrounding hills. Streams ran through the city, and the sound of water from 15 conduits mingled with the lapping of the Thames. And the smell was such that one chronicler called it a thick, heavy cloud, baking smoke, boiling glue, rotting vegetables, tanneries, and horse dung, all of which the people had to breathe." And in 1348, the Black Death came. In a matter of months, the plague killed around 40% of all Londoners. There was no time to bury them one by one. They dug mass graves beyond the city walls. But even that did not kill the city. It rebuilt its population, just as it rebuilt its walls after every fire. By the end of the 15th century, London held about 85,000 people. And then came the thing that changed the city's scale forever. It exploded. 85,000 by 1565, 200,000 by 1600, 300,000 by 1666. A four-fold rise in 100 years. London became the third city of the Western world, after Constantinople and Paris. It grew rich on trade. In the very heart of the city, the Royal Exchange opened, covered galleries where 150 merchants kept their stalls, selling goods from across the world. The city simply could not hold so many people. It was still squeezed inside its old walls, still almost entirely wooden, the houses packed tight, upper stories leaning out over the streets until they nearly met overhead. Contemporaries complained with one voice of the filth and the stench. Butchers' offal lay rotting in the streets, and from thousands of hearths poured a coal smoke so thick that one Londoner called his city hell on earth on a foggy day. It was a powder keg, and it went off twice in one decade. First came the plague. In 1665, an epidemic broke out unlike anything since the Black Death. At its peak, more than 7,000 deaths in a single week. The rich fled to the country. The poor stayed to die. Samuel Pepys, a naval official, stayed in the city and recorded what it became. You could walk the length of Lombard Street and not meet 20 people, whole families, 10 or 12 together, swept away. Even his own doctor, who had promised to keep him safe from infection, died of it. The only sound, he wrote, was the tolling of funeral bells day and night, and the graveyards filled so full that the earth on them swelled 2 or 3 feet higher than before. In the next year, in September 1666, a fire started in a bakery on Pudding Lane. The summer was hot and dry. A strong wind was blowing. The city was made of wood, and the flames took hold. It burned for 4 days and destroyed 5/6 of the city, 13,000 houses, 87 churches, the old St. Paul's Cathedral. The walled city had ceased to exist. Samuel Pepys, saving what he could, buried in his garden not only his papers, but his wine and a wheel of Parmesan. And when a culprit was wanted, they found a scapegoat in a Frenchman named Hubert. He confessed to starting it and was hanged, though, as it turned out, he had only arrived in London 2 days after the fire began. And here again is London's defining trait. The fire became not an ending, but a revolution, one that fit into a single law. The king and the city passed a rebuilding act that banned building in timber. From now on, only brick and stone. The new London rose from the ashes as a fundamentally different city, not a flammable wooden maze, but brick and far more solid. In the first 2 years alone, more than 1,000 houses went up. The rebuilding was led by Christopher Wren, and it was paid for by a special tax on coal. The city was rebuilt, quite literally, on the money from the very fuel that blackened it. Wren raised 51 churches anew and St. Paul's Cathedral with the great dome that would become the city's symbol. He changed the very skyline of London. In place of the flat medieval towers, a forest of white spires rose above the roofs. Much of it still stands. And the memory of the fire, he and his colleague Hooke set in stone, the monument, a column exactly 202 feet tall, because that was the distance from it to the bakery on Pudding Lane where it all began. In the 18th and 19th centuries, London did what no city before it had done. It became the largest city in the world. 500,000 people around 1700, 1 million by 1800, 6.5 million by 1900. It outgrew its old walls so completely that they were forgotten. The city, as one writer put it, unbuttoned them like a tight corset. This growth was driven by empire, and empire entered the city through the river. The Port of London became the gateway to half the world's trade, thousands of ships a year. But there were nowhere near enough wharves for the whole vast port, less than half a mile of legal quay, and ships waited weeks to unload. So they dug docks. On the Isle of Dogs rose the West India Docks. 300 acres of artificial lakes ringed by warehouses, the largest private building project in the city's history. One tobacco warehouse at Wapping covered more ground under a single roof than any building on Earth except the pyramids of Egypt. But the growth had a price, and the river paid it. The city poured everything into the Thames, and by mid-century, it had become an open sewer. In the hot summer of 1858, the stench grew unbearable. It went down in history as the Great Stink. In Parliament, right on the bank, the windows were hung with sheets soaked in chlorine so that members could sit. The city's answer still works today. The engineer Joseph Bazalgette laid more than 1,000 miles of pipe beneath London and carried the waste away from the river. And to hide the main sewer, he reclaimed a whole embankment from the Thames, the Victoria Embankment. People walk it today without knowing his sewer runs beneath their feet. And in 1863, London did something else never seen before. It opened the first underground railway in the world. The trains ran below ground on steam, in smoke and soot, with a taste of sulfur on the lips, as passengers complained, but on the very first day, 30,000 people rode it. The aged Prime Minister Palmerston, nearly 80, refused to ride the trial run, remarking that at his age, it was wiser to stay above ground as long as possible. And the work ran so close to the old graveyards that one day the underground river fleet burst into the half-built tunnel and washed in water along with bones from the flooded burial grounds. And over all of it hung the famous London fog. The pea souper, 500,000 coal fires mixed their smoke with the damp off the river, and a murk rose over the city 60 meters high, now black, now bottle green, now yellow as pea soup. A fog that, one witness said, catches you by the throat. On some days, the fog stood so thick inside the theaters that the actors could not be seen from the stage. It was a city of dazzling wealth and terrible poverty pressed together. Magnificent squares, and a stone's throw away, the slums where the poor of all the world crowded in. In one 8-room house, several families at once. In the cellar, an old man and his wife and their lodgers. On the ground floor, a couple with 8 children. Above them, more families with boarders. In one block of Kensington, there were 49 privies for 1,000 people, and not a drop of running water. When the architect John Nash cut his grand Regent Street through the city, he ran it deliberately as a border, a wall between the wealthy West and the working East. By 1939, London had reached its peak, 8.5 million people, more than ever in its history. And then fire came from the sky, the last and most terrible of the fires that had stalked the city for 2,000 years. In September 1940, the Blitz began. Almost every night, for months, German bombers came for London. On the night of the 7th of September, telegraph poles caught fire from base to crown. Firemen raced through the flames toward blazes nothing could be done about. Half a mile of riverbank was alight, burning barges drifting on the current. One witness wrote that it was like a lake in hell. And on the 29th of December 1940, on a night they called the Second Great Fire of London, a photographer caught the dome of St. Paul's rising out of a sea of smoke and flame. And that image became the picture of the whole war. The city burns, but the cathedral stands. The figures of the Blitz are grim. Nearly 30,000 civilians killed in London alone. The city, holding a fifth of the country's population, took half of all its bombing deaths. On the worst night, the 10th to the 11th of May 1941, 100,000 incendiary bombs were dropped at once, 50,000 homes destroyed, 2 million more damaged. The city alone lost a third of its pre-war buildings. The center of London became, in one writer's words, a lunar capital, shallow, cratered, extinct. And yet, as the Romans did after Boudica, as the citizens did after 1666, London did not break. People went down into the underground for the night, as into Alfred's stone shell, and waited out the bombs below ground. Over 2 years of the Blitz, inner London emptied by almost half, people fled or died. But every morning, after every raid, the city dug itself out and went back to work. When the war ended, London lay in ruins. And once again, for the umpteenth time in 2,000 years, the question rose, How to rebuild the city. Post-war London was sooty, shabby, full of craters and empty lots where whole streets had burned. They set about rebuilding it on a vast scale, and in great haste. Between 1945 and 1970, more than 200,000 council flats went up in the inner city, and on the ruins of the Blitz rose concrete towers, around 400 across London. It was a faith in the new, instead of the horizontal rhythm of the old streets, vertical concrete. Right on a spot bombed flat beside the ancient Roman fort, the Barbican rose, a whole concrete city within the city. So, 18 centuries on, concrete towers stood exactly where a garrison of Roman legions had once been. But not all of the new took root. The concrete towers proved cold and grim, and the first of them were already being torn down in the 1980s. The city went back to brick and ordinary streets, as if it had remembered itself. And in 1952, London paid an old debt one last time. The famous fog, building up for centuries, thickened in December into a deadly smog. In a few days, it killed thousands. And that, at last, forced the banning of coal fires and the centuries-old London murk. The very fog that had hidden Dickens's streets and frightened the Victorians vanished for good. The last great change came, once again, through the river. In the 20th century, the docks died, ships had grown too big, and the port moved downstream. The huge warehouses stood abandoned, until, in the late 1980s, on the site of the West India docks, Canary Wharf rose, a gleaming district of glass and steel towers. Where the sugar and tobacco of empire were once unloaded, banks now stand, and the power station on the South Bank was turned into a museum, Tate Modern. New towers rose over the city, the Gherkin, then the Shard, 310 meters, the tallest building in Britain. The city climbed upward again, as the Roman Londinium once climbed upward in its tenement blocks. And here is what lies beneath it all. Modern London stands in layers upon itself. The Roman wall beneath Alfred's medieval street grid, that beneath the brick of the Great Fire, that beneath the Victorian city, and glass and steel on top. Dig almost anywhere in the city, and you strike someone's earlier London. Let's go back to where we began. Was? London was never meant to be. On this bank, there was no city, no village, only a river an army needed to cross. Foreign men planted a port here by military calculation, and almost at once it was burned to the ground. And then it burned again and again, rebel tribes, endless fires, plague, the Great Fire, bombs from the sky. Any one of those blows would have been enough to erase the city. But every time, it rose again, and every time as something new. Wooden after the fire, it became brick. Abandoned, it was settled again. Bombed flat, it was rebuilt. Out of a Roman fort on a marsh grew the greatest city on earth. Out of a city begun by foreign hands grew a capital where 300 languages are spoken today. The Roman wall still juts from the ground at Tower Hill. The bridge is still where the Romans threw the first one. Wren's Dome stands as it stood in the smoke of the Blitz, and the Thames still flows past, the same river they set out to cross 2,000 years ago. The city that was never meant to be is still standing, and it is still growing.